So I'm going to show you how I went from this right here to this right here. Super fancy. Let's get it. So to begin with, I cleaned my workspace, moved all my crap out of the way, gave myself a nice clean area to maneuver in. Story time. So I've had my buddy's old steps chilling in my garage for the last 6 months. When we replaced them with new ones, I kept the old ones thinking, man, these will be great for our project one day. Well, friends, this is that project. Anyway, I had to rip apart the existing steps, I had to strip the old paint off of them, and then I ran them through a planer to try to get them somewhat flat, which ultimately didn't work. You'll see that later. The best part is, I lost all of that footage. Don't ask me how, I don't know. I feel really dumb. Mistakes were made. In fact, a lot of mistakes were made in the making of this video. I'll probably point them all out to you one by one. In fact, don't be surprised if this turns into one giant roast in how I do things. So, hold on to your socks. So what you're seeing right now is I'm recutting the bevel into the top of the step using a router, just cleaning up the edge and getting some more of that paint off. Ultimately, this is going to be the bottom of my shelf. You're not going to see it. It's really just a detail thing on my end. After that, I got to sanding. I used my orbital sander and went from 32 grit up to 180 grit and just knocked off all the stuff that the planer didn't get. I did only go to 80 grit on the bottom of the shelves because nobody's coming in to fondle the bottom of my shelves. Only the top needs to be silky smooth. You might also notice that the sandpaper I'm using is larger than the sander that I'm using. That's because I'm recycling the sandpaper that I used when I redid my hardwood floors. Call me cheap, but I paid for that and I'm going to use it until I can't anymore. Cue mandatory shots of sexy natural wood grain. For this project, I'll be using Minwax Dark Walnut Wood Stain. Now I'm going to get a lot of crap for the way I prep these boards for staining. A normal person would use mineral spirits to wipe down the dust and stuff, but this is a small personal project, so I'm just using a rag. From there, I applied my stain with a foam brush, just kind of working it into cracks and crevices as I went. I don't like to wipe the stain off my project as I go, I just kind of push and pull until I get a nice even coat across the project. Also, this is where the mistakes that I've made during the prep process really start to show. If you look closely enough, you can see burn marks where I improperly planed my board, and on the edges, you can see where the stain didn't take because I still have paint residue that I didn't sand off. Regardless, I think these came out looking pretty good. Granted, they're not going to win any type of floating shelf design contest, but they're only going in my room. Form follows function, as they say. These things are meant to hold stuff in my room. Looking good is just kind of bonus points. While I let that stuff dry, I used a rare earth magnet to find my studs. Basically, I ran the thing across the wall until it hit a screw head. Bingo. This is where the drywall is attached to the stud. I did this a few more times, marking the location of each screw. It gave me a general idea of where each stud was. For my frame, I used these 1x1s. I was aiming for a low profile look. However, in the future, I would not advise using 1x1s. They have a tendency to split, which ultimately leads to a lot of problems during the assembly process. I took the 1x1 that I was going to secure to my wall studs and I measured it to the length of my shelf. I cut each piece to size using my table saw, but somehow still managed to botch the length. This led to a whole lot of problems during my framing process. I measured out where the studs were in relation to where I wanted my shelf to sit. From there, I drilled some pilot holes. I drilled 2 holes per stud, careful to keep each hole toward the middle of the board in an effort to avoid splitting. To make a long process very short, it looked like this when I mounted everything to the wall. After cutting the long portion of my frame, I started to cut the smaller supports on my miter saw, which I forgot about. Don't do it like this. Measure each one individually and then cut it. I was trying to cut corners and it made my framing process even more of a nightmare than it already was. At this point, it was time to drill some pocket holes in my supports. I had never done this before, but with the help of this little jig I got off of Amazon for like $13, it was actually pretty easy, especially after I learned how to set it up. Jumping to assembly, I took my supports, added some wood glue, and then drove a screw through that pocket hole that we just drilled into the start of my frame. I attached 4 supports per shelf, paying attention to the spacing between each one, keeping in mind I had to drive another 3 screws in order to completely secure my cleat to the wall. However, this is where my nightmare turned into a reality, because I didn't actually do that. Instead, I secured the face of my frame to the supports without driving those necessary screws into the studs, which made that process 100 times harder. I used nails and glue, so the frame face wasn't about to pull off nice, and I just kind of dealt with it. This is also where I found out my supports weren't all the same length, which made attaching that face a mess because nothing aligned up exactly. I just powered through it. My short cleats also came into play here. I tried lengthening them with scraps and glue and nails, but that fix fell apart when I tried to secure my supports with my pocket screws. Ultimately, I decided to relocate my support, which contributed to the issues securing my top cleat. Like I said, framing was a nightmare for me. Finally, I got to installing the shelves, which I thought would have been the easiest part of this whole project. However, I started off by using the wrong size nails to attach the shelf itself, and then realizing on top of that neither of these shelves was actually flat. I just added all this to the list of things that went wrong during this project, leveled out the shelves as best I could, and moved on to the next part of the project, knowing that I would just have to deal with it. Luckily for me, the last part of this build entails hiding all of the things that I did wrong, which is made a little bit harder by the fact that these shelves aren't perfectly flat, but like I said, I'll just deal with it. I got some Rust-Oleum flat black spray paint and went to town on some trim. Now this wasn't the original trim I planned on using, but that's a story for another day. I think it came out pretty nice regardless. While I waited for my paint to dry, I came inside, cut some Luan to size, and stained it. This is just to hide the supports on the bottom of my top shelf. With my paint finally dry, I attached my trim to the frame with brad nails. And no, that trim is not supposed to be gloss. At this point, all I had left to do is to hang my Luan with the help of some clamps. I used painter's tape to mark where my supports were. And with that, I give you some sexy shots of some shelves that used to be stairs. Ultimately, I'm really happy with how these turned out, regardless of how many mistakes I made. I actually learned quite a bit, and I'm going to use that knowledge to help me with a similar project in the future. So, if you've made it this far into the video, I'd like to thank you. Having someone take the time out of their day to watch my videos in their entirety really means a lot, and I'm very grateful for that type of support. If this is the type of content that you like to see, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I'm what you might consider an ADHD enthusiast. My interests are all over the place, but if you like this video, chances are you'll like some of my future videos. Once again, thanks for watching.